Well, good morning and welcome to the CCC Trials Day or Open Day 2020. It's been kindly hosted again by the Gentle family down here at Hale Farm. And on behalf of CCC, I would like to express our thanks for all of the effort that's gone into preparing the trials and hosting the site again this year. Sadly, due to the COVID-19 social distancing requirements, this year's event is going to be an online one only. Given the amazing weather today, that is clearly a great shame. It would have been lovely to have hosted you all down here today. But anyway, we'll try and make the best of it. And the key thing, what we're going to try and do today is to highlight the relative varietal attributes and equally weaknesses to aid planning with regards to cropping this autumn. As has been the pattern in the last few years, and we've been down here for I think at least 15 years now, and I lose track of the time. In essence, the trial is designed to pull out the strengths and weaknesses of different varieties. We always try and aim to drill the trial relatively early to generate disease pressure. This year, those plans went out the window, along with a lot of other plans, due to the exceptional wet weather and subsequent monsoon-like conditions that endured through much of the autumn and winter. However, the trials contractors we use made use of a very brief weather window on the 10th of October to drill the trial at 275 seeds using a low till drill, and the crop followed lupins, so should have been a reasonable amount of fertility, but clearly the wet winter this year washed most of the nitrogen out of the soil. And we did do a deep nitrogen test in March as normal, and that revealed that there was only 52 kilos of nitrogen in the top 90 centimetres of soil, so not an awful lot kicking around really. We then applied nitrogen in 4 splits, and again, because of the weather conditions, we couldn't actually travel until around about the 15th, 20th of March, which is later than we would have liked. The growth regulator programme was actually quite light this year because the season was characterised by the low fertility. Crop canopies were not overly dense coming out of the winter, so it just had a 3C chlormequat and a 0.15 modus at T0, which was early April actually. That was then followed by 3/4 litre of Spatial Plus towards the end of April at the T1 timing. This is part of a national ARCC programme as well, so we will share the results later on. And I probably ought to just remind everyone, not that we really want reminding, of the challenging weather conditions that were endured. It started raining on about the 21st of September and didn't really relent until about the middle of March. So drilling was certainly very challenging, but a lot of our growers have managed to get sort of 70 to 80% of their wheat in the ground this year, which is a credit to everybody's efforts in achieving that really. And hopefully those efforts will be rewarded by good grain quality and hopefully some respectable grain prices this harvest.
Good morning, my name is Richard Cartwright. I think most of you know me, but I thought I'd better just tell you in case you don't. I'm standing in the winter wheat class 1 varieties at Hale Farm, West Wittering. And on my left hand side here we have Crusoe, which has been around since 2012. It's a class 1 milling variety which has been very successful in the past. It continues to produce moderate yields compared with some of the others, and its main issue is brown rust. I mean, brown rust has and is in this part of the world a major problem, and the fungicide spend on this variety would be probably 30 or 40 pounds a hectare, maybe more than some of the other varieties that are on my left here, in order to produce a top quality milling variety. The protein conversion on this variety is always very good, and from the protein point of view, it's one of the most consistent varieties and requires less than some of the other varieties that are group 1s. It's not an early drilling variety, and if you drill it too early, particularly on the southern coast, the brown rust will be an issue right from the word go. And we've even been putting on fungicides in the autumn in order to suppress the brown rust levels and those early drill crops. So it will be around next year. Don't drill it too early, and don't put it in a second wheat situation, because it doesn't like or doesn't grow very well in that situation compared with some of the other class 1s. On my left hand side here is illustrious. Illustrious has been on the list for a number of years. It's never really taken off as a class 1 because of Skyfall and Zayat, which I'll come to in a minute. Its yield is slightly below Zayat and Skyfall, but it does have other aspects which are quite useful. Its yellow rust rating is good, and I think there will be 1 or 2 people that will be growing this variety next year. It has been grown for a number of years, as I say. It does require quite a high level of nitrogen input in order to achieve the grain quality, but it does spread your yellow rust risk. And the millers actually quite like it as well, but it does tend to, as I say, make it slightly harder to achieve that protein level, which is the all-important aspect for milling wheat growing. Now move on to Skyfall, which has been around since 2014 on the list. Skyfall, as you can see, is a bearded wheat. We all know that, but its main problem now is with yellow rust, and it's got a rating of 5 for yellow rust, so it's not really very suitable for that early drilling slot, because the yellow rust is likely to be a major problem next year when there's so much inoculum around. The millers like it as a variety, and it's good as both a first and a second wheat. And the major benefit to this compared with the other class 1s, it does have resistance to wheat blossom midge. So I would be inclined to be putting Skyfall in at the later drilling slots, both first and as a second wheat, from the point of view of its yellow rust susceptibility, its septoria susceptibility, because it's only now got a rating of 5.8 for septoria, and the fact it's also blossom midge resistant. In terms of yield, it's slightly lower than the variety on my right, which is Zayat, which is now probably the mainstay, I would suggest, of the milling wheat options. Zayat came in 2017 and has taken, certainly from my point of view, with the acreage that I've got, the biggest share of class 1s. It's most suitable of any of the 4 varieties I've talked about for early drilling, and if you drill it early on, particularly on heavy ground, it does respond to that very well, and it performs well in that situation because I think its septoria resistance is good. It's got a 6.2 for 6.4, I think, actually, for septoria, and it's got a very good eye spot rating, and it stands well if you put growth regulator on, which obviously most people would in a milling wheat situation where you're putting on high levels of nitrogen in order to achieve the yield potential and the quality that you're after in terms of the protein in the grain.
Right, we're going to run through the class 2 milling wheat options now, and on my left we've got X Days, and on my right here we've got slightly more established variety Siskin. Both varieties will get a small premium in the milling market. X Days potentially is on offer with haygates at 4 backs from around about 12 to 15 pounds a tonne for 13% protein. So it could be a useful contender as an alternative to some of the class 1 varieties that Richard covered a minute ago, for those that don't want to maybe invest quite so heavily in protein building with nitrogen rates or maybe they're on lighter ground as well. Both varieties have a number of interesting attributes, and in particular the new arrival, which one or two farms have been growing this year, X-Days on my left here, I would highlight that it's got an acceptoria rating of 8.1, which is the highest on the list, with the exception of, I believe, Theodore, which is a new class 4 wheat. But in the class 2 or quality section, it's certainly the variety with the highest septoria resistance rating, which is an important consideration for growers next year, because sadly we have lost one of the key active ingredients that supported our anti-resistance fungicide strategies, i.e. chlorothalonil, on May the 20th of this year. So looking ahead, then, varieties with good septoria resistance are going to be an important consideration to manage fungicide expenditure and also septoria management. The other features really of X-Days, which I would highlight while we're on X-Days, are it's got a reasonable brown rust rating of 7, but certainly last year in trials, brown rust came in quite aggressively later on, so it's certainly something you've got to watch in terms of your fungicide programs. Unlike Skyfall, which Richard highlighted earlier, X-Days has got a very, very good yellow rust rating currently of 9, which does take the risk out of yellow rust management and spreading the spray workload on a farm as well. So that's perhaps another positive point about X-Days. Its eye spot rating, like a lot of varieties, is actually quite low at 4, but that's not normally a major consideration in a first cereal situation, but it could be in second cereals if you were growing in that scenario. Mildew is rated as a 6, so in very fertile situations and later drill crops you might see mildew coming in as an issue. It's not orange wheat blossom midge resistant, unlike Skyfall, but his other attribute is that it's very early maturing. And for those older members that can perhaps remember the variety Soissons, which again was not midge resistant, but it was an Orne variety, but the most interesting attribute of that was its very early maturity. And X-Day sort of falls into that bracket. So it's one of the varieties that may well harvest towards the end of July in most years, or early August if not end of July. Certainly will be the first variety to be cut in most situations if you're growing it. So all in all, it's quite a robust package. What I would say with X-Days, it's definitely not one for early drilling. So don't consider it for September sowings. Despite its good septoria rating, it'll just fly away too quickly in the spring and be very hard to manage. So realistically, it's going to be one for October drilling onwards really, and can be drilled into the new year quite happily if you get delayed. Seems to be quite vigorous in the autumn in particular. Pretty good tillering capacity, particularly in situations with fertility. So overall, I think it's a variety that merits attention to spread workload as much as anything, both from a harvesting point of view and a septoria management side of aspects as well. So leading on now into Siskin on my right, this particular variety has been grown for the last 3 years quite widely. Unlike X-Days, it's a variety you can drill a little bit earlier. It's not quite as fast developing, but again, it's not one for very early drilling. So anybody thinking about starting mid-September on elevated situations, I would steer clear of Siskin because it'll just get too leggy and potentially fall over. Just going back to X-Days, one of the other benefits of that particular variety is it has got very good stiff straw and a good standing power. So it's quite an easy variety to manage from a standing point of view. So back to Siskin. Unlike X-Days, I mean, it's still got a good septoria rating of 6.7, which is very respectable. It makes septoria management a lot easier in many regards, particularly when it's slightly later drilled. Diseases you've got to watch with Siskin are brown rust for sure. It is quite vulnerable to it, and certainly in trials we've seen some very big responses of well over 2 to 3 tonnes a hectare in high pressure situations to controlling that particular disease. Like X-Days, it has held on to its yellow rust rating of 9, There have been the odd reports around the country of a little bit being found in crops, which is maybe not surprising because it's now in its third year. But my impression from the information I've had is the yellow rust has not been aggressive and hasn't carried on throughout the season. So it's really, I think at this stage, still a very controllable disease within the context of that variety. Like IX days, the siskin will need watching from an eye spot point of view, and it does actually make quite a good second wheat. So for those of you thinking about second wheat this year, you may be looking at siskin in that situation. Eye spot would be something to look at managing. The other diseases, well, mildew's innate, so very rarely gets any mildew issues, and it's not orange wheat blossom midge resistant either. In terms of grain quality, it's not at the same level as X-Days. It's a genuine sort of mid-spectrum class 2, I would suggest. You get small premiums in some years, but if you've got a lot of milling wheat around, the chances are it's just really going to be a feed wheat with a fairly low cost of production attached to it in terms of fungicide spend. So a useful variety, certainly proven itself on farm over the last 2 or 3 years, both as a first and a second cereal. I have to say personally I quite like it, particularly on the chalkier soils. It just seems to fit that scenario pretty well. So those are the class 2 options really that I'm going to focus on here today. There are others, but realistically the choice should be really limited to those 2 in my view. The class 3 soft wheats or biscuit making wheats, and this is a sector that's historically has been dominated by the variety Clare, but increasingly in the last few years growers have moved over to some of the new generation offerings. The first of those really was Basset, which has been around 3 years now, on my left here, and on my right we'll have a look in a minute, variety called Farfly, which has got some interesting attributes as well. So just looking at Basset first, this variety is reasonably well suited to early-ish drilling, but the big downside with it is a fairly significant weakness to Septoria tritici. And as I mentioned earlier, with the loss of chlorothalonil, Septoria is something we're going to be concerned about next year in designing fungicide programs and also managing the fungicide spend as well. And just really to highlight that, I'm just pulled in the Basset and the Farfly. Basset's the bottom here, and Septoria rating 5 compared to, as I say, X-Days at the top there at 8.1, so quite a big contrast. It's also pretty weak on brown rust. I would give it a 4 when it's early-ish drilled, and if I'm being generous, a 5 when you start drifting towards the end of October, early November. Yellow rust actually is still holding up pretty well at an 8, which is reassuring. But I think the Septoria is going to be a big Achilles heel going forward. So although there's some grower loyalty with the variety, because it has performed well on farm in the last couple of years, I think we're going to be moving away to the variety I'll come on to in a minute, Farfly. The other weaknesses really can get a bit of mildew, and you've got to watch eye spot as well. But it is midge resistant, and equally it is actually a pretty good second wheat. So for those situations it might still be worth considering, because second wheats historically get drilled a bit later, so that will inevitably reduce the Septoria pressure. So that's Basset. Right, now we're moving on to Farfly, the second biscuit wheat or class 3 I was going to highlight today. And this is a variety that's being grown for the first time on a number of farms, and despite some very challenging conditions last winter and autumn, it seems to have coped remarkably well actually. Seems to be quite vigorous, quite a free tillering variety, and I think it's worth pointing out that the ear population this particular plot looks to be a little bit higher than Basset. And the sort of shape of the ear and the way the whole crop has developed over the last year or so, in my eyes, is actually very reminiscent of Clare. And my understanding is that from the end user's perspective, the grain quality is also very similar to Clare. So they're quite excited about it from a marketing point of view, and obviously in terms of the flour they're going to produce and the end market they're going to use it for. A big attribute of Firefly over Basset is it's got a pretty good septoria rating. So it's a 7. So as I say, X day is 8.1, but you're now into a 7 for Firefly. So it is pretty robust in that sense. When it's early air drilled, you will get some septoria, particularly further west and in wetter years. So it's not something you can dismiss necessarily. But I think a little bit like Clare, which always used to get a bit of septoria, possibly is a variety that maybe can cope with it better than some. And let's hope the rating is as robust as Clare's was, bearing in mind that Clare was around for 20 years. The disease you will have to watch is brown rust. In trials last year, it was almost as bad as Crusoe, which Richard mentioned earlier. And I mean, I would say at the moment it's got a rating of 5 or 6. That could drop to a 4 in the future, depending on how widely it gets grown and equally what the seasons are like and how early it gets drilled as well. Another big attribute is the fact that it is orange blossom midge resistant. So both class 3 offerings, Basset and Firefly, are orange wheat blossom midge resistant, which I know is a feature that a number of growers are particularly interested in these days. So I think overall, if you're looking for a lower risk, lower input variety in the class 3 market, I would certainly consider Firefly. Yield wise, it's been right up there in our trials for the last 2 years, with some of the best feed wheats. So it's got high yield potential, certainly higher than Basset. And yeah, it's really, there aren't too many Achilles heels to highlight with the variety really, and quite flexible on sowing date as well. So you could consider drilling this the back end of September, right the way through until the early part of winter. So all in all, a very useful package.
So now we're moving on to the Group 4 soft wheats. There's a couple of offerings in this class. Firstly, I'll start talking about Sundance. This has been on the list for about 3 years now. Came on with a very high septoria score, which it's still got. It came on a very high 7.9, which was way above anything else on the list at the time, which is why it got quite big a market uptake. The biggest downside with Sundance is the fact that it's got a very low specific weight, 73.9 I think it is. So even in a good year you do struggle to make the grade, which means you've got to blend it in farm, which is its biggest downfall. It does tend to get some brown rust. Yellow rust isn't a problem. It's quite late developing, +2, but it does suit late drilling very well. So it will help you spread your workload, but really there is a couple more varieties coming through in this class which have better specific weights, which will supersede this variety. So now we're moving on to a new offering, RAGT Saki. It looks like a very, very good variety coming in. To start with, we've got a 6.8 for septoria, which for the west and the south is very interesting. It's also got midge resistance, so another positive. We've got an 8 for yellow rust and a 7 for brown rust, which is very strong for having both quite high. The untreated here looks exceptionally clean at the same time. Standing ability is good. It's a 7 without PGR and an 8 with PGR. And it's a +3 for maturity, which some people don't like, but if you've got a lot of wheat to get through, it's nice to have something coming in succession. And it also looks like a very handy late driller. Seems to be quite vigorous and tillers very nicely. So this and Sundance are the two standouts in the category, but I would definitely say Saki is going to take a very large majority moving on this year, just because its attributes are much better. We'll now move on to the Group 4 hard class. We'll start with JB Diego, which has been the main variety for a very long time now. It's really starting to get outclassed through disease. The yield can still be there, but there are high yields out there in the Group 4 class. Its septoria rating has slipped significantly in the last few years. There's There's also a very large issue with yellow rust, and in fact it's now dropped off the recommended list this year. So yeah, it's very hard to see where the ratings are actually slipping with this variety. There will be still some in the ground this year because it does perform on certain farms in certain scenarios, but it is definitely declining largely, and yeah, I think a couple more years and that will be this variety finished. Moving on to Graham. Takes up a very large majority of the acreage in my area. It mainly due to its septoria rating of 6.8. It's got very handy levels of resistance in terms of yellow rust, and brown rust is really the only issue you need to be wary of, but not in any real significance compared to something like Crusoe. It's very, very vigorous once it gets established. It takes a long time in the autumn to go, but when it does, it's a very, very high tillerer, covers the ground very well. It can be drilled early and late, which makes it quite flexible, not too late, but it does do well in both scenarios, and I do find it works very well on chalk. And then we've got the Gleam on the other side. Gleam is an interesting variety. Its standout position really is in a second wheat scenario. Its main downfall is its yellow rust. It will get early yellow rust, and you've got to get on top of it early, otherwise it does seem to hang around. It yields very well late, so that's why I think it suits such a good second wheat scenario. The only thing I'd be very wary of in second wheats is its eye spot is particularly low, so that's something you're really going to have to keep an eye on. But as a second wheat, probably the best around. Graham not so good, but it's a 6.3 for septoria, which is good enough. I mean, in a wet year that will still be plenty dirty enough in Dorset, but if you're drilling it late, then it fills that slot. But Graham, for me, drilled over a wide range of soils and also soil types, you'll get, it's the main variety for the Group 4 hards that is consistently giving yields. To finalise, Graham will fit most of your scenarios, and Gleam very good as a second wheat. So likewise, as we have here in Chichester, the Dorset Trail has had to be cancelled as well due to COVID-19, which is, on a day like today is such a shame. However, we have got some interesting trials there. They were drilled significantly later than this trial in the 10th of November, which should give us some good results going forward for planned late drilling. The disease risk in there was lower, and we've seen that throughout the season, that it's hard to pull up any real significant differences between the plots, but there should be hopefully some good yield results, which we'll give out once we get the data.
So in summary, on the class 1s, if you're growing just class 1s, you want to start drilling Zayat first, then move on probably to Crusoe and finish off with Skyfall. If you're worried about the level of yellow rust risk between Zayat and Skyfall, which I think will become an increasing risk, then it's worth considering the variety Illustrious in order to spread that risk. But you must make sure that you manage each variety to fulfill its yield and protein requirements in order to ensure that you actually achieve a milling sample. And don't forget, you have to combine it all as well, so that can be an issue in terms of maintaining Hagberg. On the class 2s, we've got the exciting variety Extaze from the point of view of disease resistance, and that will be very useful, as Peter has said, when you're considering that we haven't got chlorthanol next year. On the class 3s, Firefly looks to me as being the obvious contender to grow. So between the class 1s, class 2s and class 3s, we can very quickly home down on what is likely to be your varietal choice for this next season.
One of the unfortunate consequences of the season that we've experienced this year is a lot of late season leaf yellowing that's been reported in a number of cereal crops, mainly wheat, particularly along the south coast and on the southern escarpment of the South Downs. And this has been caused, we believe, by late transmitted BYDV, either by the rose grain aphid or the bird cherry aphid, or maybe a combination of both. We think that's down to the fact that we had a very mild winter, and there was probably a higher than normal overwintering population on green stubbles, and equally there has been a greater adoption of green cover in the last few years, and if that contains cereals, then again there's a host for aphids to build up on over the winter period. Bearing in mind that April was very warm this year and followed by a very warm May as well, we think the migration must have happened towards the end of April, early May, and it's basically locally transmitted BYDV, which doesn't cause the characteristic crop stunting you get from a winter infection. However, you get this local transmission which causes loss of chlorophyll in the flag leaf, the effective leaf, and we're not too sure really what the impact will be on yield, because obviously you've lost green leaf area, but the work done by ADES in terms of late transmission of BYDV post growth stage 31, first node, would indicate that yield impacts are generally quite low, and certainly the ears themselves on the affected plants look unaffected. A few years ago when we had, again, late transmission of BYDV, but earlier in the spring, we did have a degree of stunting of ears and rat-tailed ears. So not all the glooms were filling properly, but that doesn't appear to be the case this season. We suspect there may be a slight impact on specific weight, but hopefully that's the only negative consequence. So an interesting but unwanted gift from Harvest 2020.
So we're here today at our wittering site on Hale Farm again on our oilseed rape trials. This actual site was sown on the 5th of September using a direct disc drill, and we actually believe that has helped to establish the crop and get it away from cabbage and flea beetle. The rest of the field was drilled a couple of days later, and fortunately that's all established well as well. The plot is made up of various conventional varieties sown predominantly at 65 to 70 seeds per metre squared, and hybrid varieties as well as clearfield varieties as well, and they will have been sown at sort of 50 to 55 seeds per metre squared. As we know, oilseed rape is becoming a more and more tricky crop to grow, and predominantly that is caused by cabbage stem flea beetle, a pest which comes in two forms, and there are ways we can try and mitigate both, but unfortunately trying to mitigate against one tends to lead to damage from the other. And quite a lot of work this year has been done on drilling dates, and where we've seen sort of mid-August sown crops, or certainly before the 20th of August sown crops, they've got really well from the beetle damage and been significantly affected by larval numbers, and they are carrying quite substantial larval numbers, which of course will then lead to more and more adults next year. Later sown crops, they've got certainly reduced larval numbers, and they look like the ones that have survived look like they're going to be full of yield potential. Unfortunately, there are a lot of them that didn't make it that far. Anything sown sort of bank holiday weekend August onwards sort of did get hit quite badly by some of the adult flea beetle, and we have seen a reduction in the total area survived this year. So we know going forward that the oilseed rape is going to be a huge risk trying to get it away from cabbage stem flea beetle. Seed dressing wise, we have got Lumiposa seed dressing, which will help a little bit under high pressure situations, though it will not be enough. It only really gives protection until sort of cotyledon to first true leaves, which unfortunately isn't enough to get it away. Other work that's been done is on cover crops, or companion crops rather, and the only one that we've seen significant effect from is white mustard, which then leads you down the clearfield variety at additional cost, but we do think that there is a level of reduced damage in the actual oilseed rape crops. Unfortunately, the higher seed rate of white mustard, which seems to be more effective, is also reducing the vigour of the oilseed rape. Not only have we got oilseed rape and cabbage stem flea beetle to think about, but we've also got turnip yellows virus to think about, and that's transmitted through Mysis persky aphids, and the levels have gone up dramatically in the last few years, and they now believe about 80% of Mysis persky are carrying turnip yellows virus, and that has been reflected quite dramatically certainly in the recommended list, but also the southern data list. And I think we now have sort of the 5 top yielding varieties in the recommended list are all turnip yellows virus. And certainly last year, the top 5 yielding varieties at Hale Farm and the variety trials, they were all TUIV tolerant varieties. So we know we're getting significant yield decline from turnip yellows virus, which has really changed our thinking for oilseed rape varieties. And where we used to look at FOMA and light leaf spot as the key sort of traits as well as vigour, we've now sort of changed our priorities a little bit. And actually down on the south coast, we're now desperately after autumn vigour and spring vigour. Turnip yellows virus resistance is now becoming a key trait in oilseed rape varieties. And we're also obviously still after that FOMA light leaf spot and or FOMA stem canker and light leaf spot resistance to really help keep fungicide spend down. Which then really leads us onto the varieties, and I think probably the best way to do it, we're here at the West Wittering site, and there's not a huge difference between a lot of these varieties this year, and I think some of that is probably due to the wet winter we've had and dry spring as well, which hasn't led to quite the variation in height and maturity in a lot of crops. But if I work through sort of from some of the breeders, because each breeder is obviously desperate for people to carry on growing rate this year, some breeders are offering a sort of a reduced risk option, and certainly BASF, Bayer and KWS are all quite keen to do a reduced spend on your seed initially, and then after November, if you've got a crop, you will then pay the rest. If you haven't, you don't have to pay any more in terms of royalties. So that's their way to try and get you to keep on growing rape. Unfortunately, not all manufacturers rather are doing that. So DSV and Lima Grain at current aren't doing that, but watch this space because it might be something that comes forward. In terms of the varieties then, we go on to BASF initially. They've taken on the Inviga varieties from Bayer when the Bayer-Monsanto merger occurred. And they have really focused on vigour on their crop plants. So they've got the Inviga 1035, the Inviga 1040 and the Inviga 1055 as their main varieties. All of them have got excellent vigour, but unfortunately they don't have any TUIV tolerance. And therefore we would probably try and steer clear if you believe aphids are an issue. But apart from that, they have got good agronomic potential, really good spring vigour, really good autumn vigour. So there is a market for them. But personally, without that TUIV tolerance, I wouldn't potentially go for them. Onto the DSV varieties now. They've got some really exciting products coming through, varieties coming through. We've tried Temptation, which is a turnip yellows virus hybrid. That's gone on really well this year on farm. It looks good, but they've got two new ones coming through. One called Voltage. Seems to be slightly earlier than Temptation, coming into flower, a little bit more vigorous, a little bit taller, and one probably to keep an eye on. And their other one, which we're quite excited about, is Duplo, even more vigorous than the others, and again, turnip yellows virus with a good package. And that's actually been pushed through really quickly on their marketing to bring these vigorous traits through. And like I say, it's turnip yellows virus. So anyone looking to drill in that later slot, sort of mid-September, and after prepared to spend the money on a hybrid seed, I think Duplo and Voltage could be two varieties that are really, really worth looking at. I'm sure if anyone's looked at your recommended list, they've probably seen the top varieties all on the list, all beginning with A, and that's all coming from Lima Grain. Acacia, which is a conventional variety and not actually a TUIV tolerant variety, has gone top. We've had a little bit down here, and unfortunately didn't yield quite as well as some of the TUIV tolerant varieties, but still looks like a very good conventional variety. They've got Aspire, which was obviously last year we'd looked at quite a big way. Turnip yellows virus, and again that's quite a good conventional variety if anyone's looking to maybe farm save some seed or keeping seed costs down. But what I would say, certainly this year it's been a tricky year for rape anyway, but we've seen that the Aspire maybe hasn't quite got the vigour that some of the other varieties does in the spring. But what we did find is it branched really well, really late, and we had some really late flowers, and actually they potted up quite well later on. So again, if you're prepared to put up with a slightly less vigorous spring variety, Aspire is a fantastic variety. But the one that they've got through now, really, they've got Artemis, and the one that really looking at is Ambassador, which is a high vigorous variety, really good light leaf spot, really good FOMA package. It's a 7 and 8 for both, but it's turnip yellows virus and really vigorous. Gets nice and tall, and it's a variety that we think we might major on, particularly on less fertile sites where you need that vigour to get it away. I think that's a variety really worth looking at. KWS have got a couple of varieties coming through, Blazon, which is really focusing on in the north, and Ballard, which is sort of a more southern variety, but it's not a major step. It's the conventional variety, and again, like I said, it's not turnip yellows virus, so it's probably one I wouldn't focus on too dramatically. There is of course still Campus, and Campus has been a mainstay on a lot of farms the last sort of 10 years or so, and it's proved itself year after year, and it's got that early autumn vigour, it's got that early spring vigour, but unfortunately it's not turnip yellows virus, but it is cheap seed. So anyone thinking maybe they want to go down the cheaper route of growing oilseed rape, it's a variety I would potentially look at. And it really brings us on to the sort of the final Bayer DeKalb mixtures, the DK varieties, and they've got a couple coming through. Probably the most noticeable is DK Expectation, again another vigorous hybrid variety, TUIV tolerant again, and it has looked quite promising in trials, but until we actually get the combine in a lot of these crops we won't know. So I guess watch this space and watch the yield. In terms of clearfield varieties, which obviously a lot of people have gone down for keeping in top of the cruciferous weeds, charlock, hedge mustard and runch predominantly. There's not been any major steps, but they have got a new variety coming through, Welt 569, and that looks quite exciting. It's a clearfield variety with turnip yellows virus resistance, and it's the first of its kind. So we'll just have to see how that yields. I don't know whether there's a yield penalty to it. I haven't seen much data from it, but hopefully if they can start breeding all these traits into one, and we're getting sort of pod shatter resistance, turnip yellows virus, the RLM7 FOMA resistance gene as well, we can hopefully try and get some vigorous rape varieties that can put up with quite a lot through the spring and autumn, and we can actually try and grow them as cheaply as possible. And that's sort of where a lot of the breeders I think are focusing on going. And in terms of the other clearfield varieties, we've obviously got Plurax, which has come from DSV, which is sort of taken over from Phoenix, and with DeKalb varieties as well. There's also some new varieties coming through. They're sort of pushing on from the initial varieties. But I think really, if you're wanting to keep costs down, unless you've got a significant charlotte problem, I think we try and steer clear of the clearfield rape and maybe just focus on pure vigour and keeping costs as low as possible. And I say going away from the clearfield varieties may be a way to do that. But all in all, we'll have to wait and see what the combine does here, and we'll put forward on the data once we've got it and see how each variety is pulled apart, because earlier on in the year there's quite significant differences in vigour in varieties, and unfortunately you can't see that now. But yeah, I think really we're looking for vigour, TUIV tolerance before we're looking at FOMA and light leaf spot now. So it's worth mentioning that this year, with the amount of oilseed rape that we lost due to cabbage and flea beetle, it sort of encouraged some growers maybe to try some spring oilseed rape, particularly looking at some of the new hybrid varieties, as there's been some quite major developments coming through with the hybrid varieties and increasing yield, particularly over the sort of conventional varieties that people have been growing sort of 10, 15 years ago. There's 3 varieties that really stand out. Lumen has been around for a little while. We've got a little bit of a small acreage of that about. Lagonda, which came out I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, and the new one coming out this year from BASF called Performer. It's worth noting that on the recommended list that the number of trials that these varieties have been in is pretty limited. Lumen has been in a total of 9 trials, Lagonda and Performer I think only 4 or 5. So the data we've got is pretty small. This year within CCC we've got some seed rate trials looking at different seed rates and establishment of oilseed rape, spring oilseed rape, sorry. And on another farm we've also got some variety trials just trying to pick out some of the key traits that these varieties are bringing. And again, it'll be really interesting to follow the yield through. The pros, obviously, with spring oilseed rape is you don't get cabbage stem flea beetle, and of course, if oilseed rape is worth something, it's a valuable crop to grow. You can get a good margin. You don't have to put the same level of inputs into it. Obviously, the downside is you still get Wessex flea beetle, you still get striped flea beetle, and you still get turnip flea beetle, which can be a minor issue in the establishment of the crop. But more significantly, we've got pollen beetle. As the crop's coming to green bud, sort of yellow bud flowering, that can cause significant yield loss. But we have fortunately still got some chemistry that works against those. So if you're not reluctant to spray an insecticide, the chances are we can get it into flower. But I think the key really this year has been growing significant acreages and not sort of a 10-acre block field here or there. We've been growing significant sort of 50 to 100-acre blocks, and that's really diluted the pollen beetle levels. And so far we've been pretty fortunate to get most of our crops to flower, and fingers crossed they're looking very well.